The Trust and its planners had expectations that community in Elizabeth depended on a definite physical form, and that only a balance of people from different social classes would guarantee the development of communal relationships, with those relationships being led and directed by the natural leaders of community, the middle class. Despite claims that middle-class people would also benefit from an interaction with those beneath them, the working class, it is generally clear whose behaviour and whose culture was considered deficient. Social mix relies on the leavening effects of middle-class and working-class proximity, and proximity was believed to mean emulation. Elizabeth promised not so much just a major redistribution of opportunity for the working-class immigrants who had come to occupy the town, but a general raising of their standards. Working-class people were to be harmonised with and reconciled to the middle classes by becoming a reduced copy of them. Elizabeth's planners understood that a socially balanced city meant a city of distinct spaces for different kinds of people. From the beginning, this was to be a balanced and stratified community, so that social mix would go hand in hand with social distinction. To this end, Elizabeth would need a definite hierarchy of housing types and locations. The site happily provided one opportunity, with a flat plain for rental housing and enough high ground to provide a better class residential area as the town developed. Elizabeth could then replicate Adelaide's intricate link between elevation, however slight, and social status, and for all their superficial similarities and monotonous appearance, Elizabeth's suburbs would differ in one important respect: the proportion of rental housing. This would depend on how close your suburb was to the industrial areas and how far it was from the middle-class hill slopes. In Elizabeth's first suburbs, at all times, the main thoroughfares were lined with single homes often for sale, so that the vista presented to the passing motorist was that of normal suburban homes, not public housing. In the first Elizabeth neighbourhoods, the proportion of rental houses, mostly semi-detached, ranged from 68% in Elizabeth South and 59% in Elizabeth North, farthest from the hill slopes and closest to the industrial areas, to 44% in the upwardly inclining Elizabeth East and 39% in Elizabeth Vale, with its southerly exposure to parks and the Little Para River. Elizabeth Downs to the east ended with less than a third of its housing for rent, while extensions up the hill face were almost entirely detached houses for sale, as was Hillbank, Elizabeth's tiny Nob Hill. As the 50s came to a close, Elizabeth's economic future, and as a result South Australia's, was looking good, with the recent acquisition of land by General Motors Holden and a flurry of other notable interstate and international industrialists moving into the new town. It was soon deemed imperative that expansion was needed to develop a new industrial area, as well as the housing estates required to house the influx of new workers. Bordered by Salisbury to the south and Manapara to the north and east, west was the logical place to go. To connect the town centre more directly to the west, Winterslow Bridge was commissioned, opening in 1960 by Thomas Playford. Initially intended as an expansion of Elizabeth itself, at that time Elizabeth still came under the council district of Salisbury, and in the end, rather than expand Salisbury, Elizabeth West, Field and Smithfield Plains would all end up under the council district of Manapara. Prior to the expansion west, Elizabeth had, more or less, developed at a pace planned for by the Trust, and the physical design of those earlier suburbs reflected confidence and attention to detail to match. Now things begin to get ahead of the Trust in terms of planning these additional suburbs at the social level, and the thoughtful attention to the ratio between rental housing and home ownership made way for an urgent need to provide cheap rental housing for the expected influx of new migrant workers. These later additions of Elizabeth West, Field and Smithfield Plains, close to the western industrial area and furthest away from any hill slopes, would be dominated by double-unit rental houses. In Smithfield Plains, a whopping 74% of the housing stock was of this type. When the economic downturn of the 1970s began making itself felt, and more of Elizabeth's industrialists either folded, downsized, or simply relocated for cheaper labour costs, it is perhaps these later suburbs that suffered the most, with the highest proportion of residents dependent on factory work that was no longer there.